Have you ever noticed that you've always felt older than the people around you, even when you were young, as if life handed you a heavier lens while everyone else was still looking through glass? You listen to conversations and feel tired before they even begin, exhausted by jokes that go nowhere, by worries that feel small, by a pace of living that seems rushed and strangely empty. While others chase novelty, you find yourself searching for meaning. While they skim the surface, you sink, and you've been doing it for as long as you can remember. You were the one who noticed moods before words were spoken, who sensed tension in a room the way others sensed temperature. As a child, you didn't just play, you observed. You watched adults closely, reading between their silences, learning early that what people say and what they feel are rarely the same thing. While your peers worried about games and grades, you carried questions about fairness, loss, and why people hurt each other. No one taught you to think this way. It simply arrived quietly, like a weight placed in your hands before you were ready. As you grew older, that depth didn't fade. It followed you into friendships where you felt misunderstood, into relationships where you gave more than you received, into moments where you wondered why connection felt so rare, even when people were everywhere. You learned how to listen, how to be composed, how to stay steady while others fell apart. You became the calm one, the reflective one, the one people describe as mature, and part of you accepted that label because it explained why you felt different, why you didn't quite belong. Psychology has a name for pieces of this experience. Early emotional responsibility can wire the brain toward heightened awareness and self-regulation, shaping how the nervous system responds to the world. Attachment patterns form before we have language, teaching you whether it is safe to need, to depend, to be light. When those needs aren't met, the mind adapts. It grows inward. It learns depth before joy, vigilance before play. What looks like wisdom on the outside often begins as protection on the inside. So the question lingers, quietly but insistently. What if being an old soul isn't a gift you were born with, but a role you stepped into because you had to? What if the seriousness you carry isn't proof of insight, but evidence of pressure? There is a strange grief in realizing this, a sadness beneath the pride, because it means the depth you live with may have been forged not by destiny, but by necessity. And once you begin to see that, another question emerges, pulling you backward through time. If this feeling didn't appear out of nowhere, then where did it begin? Have you ever looked back at your childhood and realized you were never really a child at all, at least not in the way others were? While some kids ran freely through noise and mess, you learned early how to be quiet, how to read a room, how to sense when it was better not to speak. You didn't need words to know when something was wrong. A tone of voice, a slammed door, a long silence at the dinner table told you everything. So you watched, you waited, you adapted. In many homes like this, love wasn't absent, but it was unpredictable. Sometimes it was warm, sometimes distant, sometimes entirely focused on survival. A parent lost in their own stress, grief, or emotional absence doesn't announce it to a child. The child feels it, and when attachment needs aren't met consistently, the nervous system learns a lesson that runs deeper than memory. Needing too much is dangerous, so you learn to need less. You became self-sufficient before you knew what that word meant. You didn't ask for comfort, you became calm. You didn't express fear, you analyzed it. There's a quiet moment many old souls recognize, a child sitting in the corner of a room full of adults, not bored but alert. You listened to conversations that weren't meant for you. You sensed the unspoken resentment between parents, the exhaustion behind forced smiles. No one told you to grow up faster. You simply understood that emotional depth was a form of safety. If you could see what was coming, maybe you could protect yourself from it. Like a garden without water, your inner world learned to grow roots deep instead of wide. Psychology calls this adaptation. Neuroscience shows how a child's brain reshapes itself around unpredictability, sharpening emotional awareness while dampening spontaneity. Attachment theory explains how praise for being mature can quietly replace care for being vulnerable. You were told you were strong, responsible, wise for your age. No one asked if you were tired, so you wore that praise like a mask, not realizing it was slowly becoming your face. As the years passed, this early seriousness settled into your bones. It followed you into adolescence, where you felt older than your peers, and into adulthood, where you carried an unspoken weight others couldn't see. You didn't choose this depth, it chose you. It grew in the shadows of what was missing, shaped by what you had to become to feel safe. And somewhere between who you were and who you had to be, a question quietly formed. If this was how you survived childhood, then who did you become because of it? Have you noticed how calm you appear to others, even when something inside you is constantly scanning, calculating, holding itself together? Somewhere along the way, emotional self-management stopped being something you did and became who you are. You learned how to keep your voice steady, your reactions measured, your feelings neatly folded away. Not because you wanted distance, but because distance once felt like safety. And now that discipline wears a familiar shape, a composed exterior that rarely cracks, in everyday life this shows up quietly. You are the one people talk to when they need clarity. The listener in the group, the advisor in a crisis, the person who doesn't need much reassurance. In relationships, you offer understanding before you ask for it. You sit across from someone you care about, nodding, absorbing their worries, translating their emotions back to them with surprising accuracy. They leave feeling lighter. You stay carrying the weight that never quite found a place to land. Over time, this restraint begins to look like wisdom. Others admire your calm and mistake it for emotional mastery. Neuroscience helps explain why this happens. When the brain learns early that strong emotion leads to instability, it strengthens circuits for regulation and suppression. Attachment theory shows how people who learn to self-soothe too soon often become highly attuned to others while remaining disconnected from their own needs. From the outside, it looks like balance. From the inside, it feels like standing behind glass. You wear a mask, but not a false one. It's a mask shaped by survival, carved carefully over years. Calm becomes your armor. Thoughtfulness becomes your shield. Introspection becomes a place you retreat to when the world feels too loud. Yet beneath it, there is a quiet longing you rarely name. You watch others connect easily, laugh freely, ask for comfort without hesitation. You want closeness, but you don't quite know how to receive it without feeling exposed, as if lowering the armor would invite something dangerous back in. There are moments when the mask feels heavy. Late at night, after another day of being the strong one, the composed one, the one who understands, a subtle resentment creeps in, not toward others, but toward the role itself. You wonder when maturity stopped feeling like growth and started feeling like confinement, like a shadow that follows you even when the room is bright. This is the paradox of the old soul in adulthood. Emotional restraint, once adaptive, now limits intimacy. The very skills that protected you have begun to distance you from what you want most. And to understand why this pattern holds so tightly, you have to look beneath the mask, into the psychology that shaped it in the first place. Have you ever wondered why your mind seems to notice everything at once, as if it learned early that nothing should be missed? This isn't intuition in the mystical sense, and it isn't wisdom handed down by fate. It is biology responding to pressure. When a child grows up in an environment where emotional safety is inconsistent, the brain does something remarkable and costly at the same time. It adapts by growing alert. Neuroscience shows that early stress reshapes the nervous system. The brain becomes exceptionally good at pattern recognition, scanning for shifts in tone, mood, and behavior. What begins as emotional attunement slowly turns into hyper-awareness. You don't just hear words, you feel undercurrents. You don't just experience moments, you anticipate outcomes. This is the mind learning vigilance, the way a body learns to tense before impact. It's not overthinking, it's a survival response that never quite learned when to turn off. Attachment theory helps explain why emotional self-containment feels safer than expression. When closeness once led to disappointment, confusion, or emotional overload, the nervous system learned that restraint equals control. So you regulate before you relate. You observe before you participate. Emotional regulation, which psychologists often celebrate as maturity, arrived before you had the chance to experience emotional freedom. The child didn't feel secure enough to be spontaneous, so seriousness stepped in as a substitute. You can see this pattern play out in adult life. In tense situations, others react first and reflect later. You do the opposite. Your heart rate barely changes, your face remains calm, your thoughts move ahead of the moment. Inside, however, there is constant monitoring. Your nervous system stays slightly activated, like a guard who never leaves their post. Studies on early responsibility show that children who are forced to self-manage too soon often develop exceptional control, but pay for it with chronic internal tension. This is why the old soul feels both composed and exhausted. Emotional awareness without emotional release is like a garden without water, orderly, contained, but slowly drying from the inside. The seriousness you carry was never a personality trait. It was a strategy, a way to prevent chaos, a way to keep the monster within asleep by never letting emotions rise high enough to wake it. Understanding this reframes everything. Your depth is not proof that you were born different. It is evidence that you were shaped early by responsibility, uncertainty, and the need to stay alert. And once you see that clearly, another truth begins to surface. What protected you then may be quietly costing you now. Because every adaptation has a shadow, and the deeper the survival skill, the heavier the price it eventually demands. Have you ever felt tired in a way sleep can't touch, as if you've been carrying years that never showed up on your face? This is the quiet shadow of being an old soul. You age internally while the world assumes you are fine, steady, unbothered. Time doesn't rush you forward, it presses downward. You move through life with an invisible gravity, holding experiences, emotions, and unspoken understanding that were never meant to be carried alone. Depth, when it arrives too early, begins to isolate. Conversations feel thin, laughter feels borrowed, and joy arrives with an expiration date. You try to join in, but part of you remains just outside the moment, observing instead of dissolving into it. Seriousness becomes your default posture, not because you lack humor, but because play requires safety, and somewhere along the way, safety became something you associated with control, not ease. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being self-sufficient for too long. You tell yourself you don't need much, and over time, you start to believe it. In relationships, you give understanding without asking for it back. You listen deeply, show up consistently, hold space without complaint. From the outside, it looks admirable. From the inside, it feels like standing in a room where the door is open, yet no one ever walks in. Emotional depth becomes distance, not by intention, but by habit. Psychologically, this is where adaptation hardens into identity. When self-reliance is praised and vulnerability goes unnoticed, the nervous system learns to withdraw quietly rather than risk disappointment. Studies on emotional suppression show that unexpressed feelings don't disappear. They retreat into the body, settling as tension, fatigue, and a vague sense of emptiness. The monster within doesn't rage, it hibernates, and that hibernation slowly drains warmth from your inner world. You may notice it in subtle ways, a dull resentment when others seem carefree, a fear of being truly seen, because being seen once meant being needed more than you could give. A strange grief when you realize how little space you've allowed yourself to be soft. Like a garden without water, everything looks orderly on the surface, but nothing new seems to grow. This is the paradox no one warns you about. The more depth you carry, the heavier lightness becomes. The more capable you are alone, the harder it feels to let someone close. There is no dramatic breakdown, no visible collapse, just a slow emotional withdrawal, a quiet narrowing of the world. And yet, this shadow doesn't exist in isolation. It is not only personal, it is shaped, rewarded, and reinforced by the world around you. To understand why this weight goes unnoticed for so long, you have to look beyond yourself, into the culture that quietly teaches you to carry it. Have you noticed how the world seems to smile approvingly when you are calm, contained, and uncomplaining, as if your seriousness reassures everyone that nothing will fall apart? From a young age, you were likely told you were strong for your age, or wise beyond your years, words that sound like compliments but often function as quiet instructions. They teach you that being easy to manage is admirable, that emotional restraint is maturity, and that needing less makes you more valuable. In classrooms, workplaces, and families, responsibility is praised long before it is understood. The child who doesn't disrupt, who doesn't ask too many questions, who handles things on their own, is rewarded with trust and admiration. No one asks what that child gave up to become so composed. In psychology, this is known as role reinforcement. When a behavior is rewarded, the nervous system learns to repeat it, even if it costs something internally. Over time, seriousness becomes not just a trait, but a social currency. You carry this conditioning into adulthood. In relationships, your calm is mistaken for emotional stability. In professional spaces, your self-control is interpreted as competence. Modern culture, driven by productivity and performance, quietly favors people who don't slow the system down with feelings. Emotional processing takes time. Vulnerability disrupts momentum. So the world elevates those who can keep going, who can carry weight without complaint. You become useful. You become reliable. You become invisible to your own needs. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper cultural imbalance. We live in a world that values output over inner life, efficiency over integration. Strength is defined by endurance, not by sensitivity. Softness is tolerated only when it doesn't interfere with progress. For someone like you, already conditioned to self-contain, this culture feels strangely familiar. It mirrors the early environments where you learned that emotional depth should be managed privately, not shared openly. There is a quiet moment many old souls recognize. Someone thanks you for being so understanding, so grounded, so easy to talk to. You smile, nod, and accept the praise. Inside, something tightens, because that admiration is rarely followed by curiosity about you. Your depth is welcomed only when it serves others. Your calm is valued, but your fatigue remains unseen. Like a mask that earns applause while hiding a shadow beneath it, social reward reinforces emotional distance. Neuroscience shows that repeated suppression, even when socially rewarded, increases stress over time. The body keeps score. The monster within doesn't disappear because the world approves of your restraint. It simply learns to wait longer, deeper in the shadows, and slowly you begin to realize the cost of being so adaptable, so mature, so strong. Because what the world rewards, it also asks you to pay for. And the bill doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up quietly, inside you, in ways no one else can see. Have you ever felt alone in a room full of people, not because no one was there, but because no one could see where you actually live inside? This is the quiet consequence of being an old soul. You sit calmly while life moves loudly around you, conversations overlapping, laughter spilling, moments passing, and somehow none of it quite reaches you. You are present, attentive, even engaged, yet emotionally just slightly out of reach, like a shoreline no one ever swims to. Over time, this becomes a specific kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of being admired without being known. People see your composure, your insight, your steadiness. They praise how grounded you are, how thoughtful, how easy you are to talk to. But admiration is not intimacy. It rarely asks what you need, and slowly you learn that being valued does not mean being held. You feel this most clearly when you struggle, when exhaustion settles into your bones and you consider asking for help. Something tightens. Words don't come easily. Your nervous system hesitates, shaped by years of self-reliance. Attachment theory explains this resistance well. When early connection felt uncertain, the mind learned that reaching out carried risk. So even now, as an adult, vulnerability feels like stepping into cold air without a coat. You tell yourself you'll handle it. You always do. There's a quiet image that captures this state. You sitting alone at night, lights dim, the world finally still enough to hear your own thoughts. The mask comes off for a moment, and what you feel isn't dramatic pain, but a heavy emotional fatigue. a sense that you've been carrying too much for too long. Neuroscience shows that chronic emotional suppression taxes the body, draining energy, dulling joy, leaving behind a low hum of sadness that's hard to name. The monster within doesn't scream, it whispers endlessly. In relationships, this loneliness takes another shape. Casual connections feel shallow, like skimming water you know runs deep. But intimacy feels dangerous, because letting someone close would mean admitting how much you actually feel. You become emotionally homeless, too deep to float comfortably on the surface, too contained to fully let yourself sink into another person. You stand at the edge watching others belong. This is where resentment sometimes quietly forms, not loud or bitter, but subtle. A sadness that no one ever asks how you're really doing. A fear that if you stopped being the strong one, the composed one, there would be nothing left to offer. Like a garden without water, your inner world survives, but it doesn't bloom. And yet, even in this heaviness, something begins to shift. Because loneliness, when finally seen, can become information. And information, when held gently, can open a door you once believed was sealed shut. What if healing doesn't ask you to become someone new, but to finally stop carrying what was never meant to be yours alone? For someone who learned early that seriousness equals safety, the idea of softness can feel reckless. Yet growth, real growth, often begins not with effort, but with permission. Permission to need, permission to rest, permission to be unfinished. There is a quiet shift that happens when you allow yourself to depend, even a little. Not in a dramatic way, but in small moments that feel almost insignificant. Letting someone see you unsure, admitting you don't have the answer, sitting with discomfort instead of translating it into understanding. Attachment research shows that secure connection is built not through constant strength, but through mutual regulation. When you let yourself be supported, your nervous system learns a new language, one that says closeness doesn't always lead to collapse. Redefining strength is part of this unlearning. Strength is not the absence of need. It is the capacity to stay present with need without self-rejection. Neuroscience tells us that play, curiosity, and emotional expression activate restorative systems in the brain, lowering stress and rebuilding resilience. This is why practicing lightness matters. Laughing without explanation, doing something pointless simply because it feels good, letting joy arrive without interrogating it. Like watering a garden that has survived too long on restraint, these moments don't erase depth, they nourish it. There may be resistance at first, a voice inside that warns you not to drop the mask, not to wake the monster within. That voice was once useful. It protected you when you were small, but you are no longer trapped in those rooms, no longer responsible for holding everything together. Healing is not about silencing that voice, it's about thanking it, then choosing differently. Integration, not erasure. You keep your insight, your sensitivity, your capacity to see beneath the surface. You simply stop confusing seriousness with truth. In relationships, this path looks like expressing needs without justification, saying I'm tired without turning it into competence, saying I need you without shrinking afterward. Emotional dependency in healthy form is not weakness. It is the nervous system learning it doesn't have to stand alone anymore. Slowly, the armor loosens, the mask becomes optional, the shadow no longer runs the show. There is a child inside you who learned too soon how to be composed. Learning to be young again does not mean becoming careless or naive. It means reclaiming the parts of you that never got to feel safe enough to play, to ask to rest. Wisdom does not require constant weight. Depth does not demand constant gravity. And when you begin to live this way, something subtle changes. The story of who you are starts to soften, not into simplicity, but into balance. And from that balance, a quieter, deeper truth begins to emerge. One that doesn't rush to explain itself, but simply waits to be understood. What if the weight you carry was never proof of wisdom, but evidence of how early you learned to hold the world together? Somewhere along your life, depth became synonymous with seriousness, and seriousness became confused with truth. You learned to move slowly through meaning, to think carefully, to feel deeply, but no one ever told you that depth was not meant to be a burden. you drag behind you like a shadow. There is a quiet misunderstanding at the heart of the old soul. You were never meant to abandon lightness in order to be aware. You were never meant to trade innocence for insight. The child who watched silently, who felt too much too soon, did not lose something forever. They paused it, tucked it away, and now, as an adult, you stand at a strange crossroads, aware enough to see the cost, strong enough to choose differently. Philosophy has always warned about imbalance. Too much reason without joy becomes sterility. Too much awareness without rest becomes despair. Even the mind, neuroscience tells us, needs oscillation between focus and play, between control and release, to remain alive. A garden that grows only roots and never flowers survives, but it does not fulfill its nature. And neither do you. You may still feel the mask at times, the instinct to contain, to manage, to stay composed when softness feels risky. That instinct doesn't disappear overnight, nor should it. It protected you, but it no longer gets to define you completely. The monster within does not need to be slain or silenced. It needs to be understood, then allowed to sleep while you live. There is a quieter truth waiting beneath all of this. Depth does not require constant gravity. Awareness does not demand perpetual vigilance. Wisdom, real wisdom, knows when to rest. It knows when to laugh without analysis, to feel without translation, to exist without explanation. Balance is not shallow. It is mature in a different way, so if you are an old soul, let this be the reframe you carry forward. You learned depth early, but you are allowed to unlearn the burden that came with it. You are allowed to be thoughtful and light, perceptive and playful, grounded and open, not because life is simple, but because you no longer need to prove that you can endure it alone. And perhaps that is the final recognition, that the deepest strength is not found in how much you can hold, but in knowing when to set something down, quietly, gently, and let yourself stand there without answers, feeling the weight lift just enough to breathe.